Good afternoon and welcome to Woody Plants, Module 1, Spring 2017. I've decided to abbreviate this module so that we have time to cover everything in class. Much of this is review. We have covered quite a bit of it so far, but I wanted to make sure that we had this resource to look over and use. So, objectives for today's module: about woody plant terminology and identification. First, why do we use the terminology that we do use? Second, how do we use it? And third, what are the basics of woody plant identification? So let's start off with reasons that plant identification is important. Of course, we know many reasons. Obviously, for our class, it's important to know plants for use in the landscape industry, just to know them to get your A in the class. But there are many other reasons. So 6 reasons here. Number 1, use of foods and medicine. Most plants are useful in some shape, form, or manner. Number 2, to be able to get more information about those plants, including number 3 here, the cultural requirements for the plants, how we can grow them in the landscape, in the garden, etc. Number 4, flower and fruit habits. Number 5, propagation methods. Of course, number 6, common disease and insect problems. This will help us to be able to understand how plants are used in the horticulture industry. So, of course, plant terminology began in Latin. And if we just use the Latin language to describe plants, like they began doing in Greek and Roman times, then we might have a difficult time remembering the names of these plants. So, for example, the carnation. Before a standardized system, using Latin terms, the carnation would have been described as Dianthus floribus solitaris squamous calicinus subovatus brevissimus corollus crenatus. A lot of names to remember there. So, obviously, we needed a better system. And, folks, this is how plants were described for thousands of years. Just another example, the oriental ivy-leaved maple, or what we would call today the Japanese maple, was previously described as Acer orientalis hederefolio. Now, that's not nearly as bad as the carnation example, but still, need something a little bit easier. So thank you. Everybody has to thank Carl von Linné, or Linnaeus, for creating the binomial system of nomenclature that is still in use today. He created this system in the mid-1700s, and he used it to methodically classify and name all organisms, not just plants. However, plants were his first focus. And in 1753, he released a work known as Species Plantarum, where he described how to use the binomial system of nomenclature for plants. And he actually described a great number of plants in Europe in those times. And of course, this system is still in use today. For botanical or plant names, scientific names, binomial nomenclature, whatever you want to call it, we use mainly Latin, although sometimes we do use some Greek and other languages in certain instances. Of course, these languages are no longer spoken. They're dead languages. So the words and the meanings of the words will likely change very little, if at all, over time. So let's look at the names of plants. Scientific name consists of two words, as you all know. The genus or generic name and the specific epithet, which together is used to describe a species. And here we use the example Quercus rubra, the red oak, very common tree found in our area. So let's go back to the Acer orientalis hederafolio. If we transcribe this to the binomial system created by Linnaeus, then it becomes what we know today as the Japanese maple, Acer palmatum. And as you can see in the picture below, you might be able to tell a little bit why it is described as that. Hederae is kind of a ivy leaf. Folio, of course, is Latin for leaf. Orientalis, oriental. So all that together becomes Acer palmatum, which describes the palmate shape of the leaf that is very rare for other maples to have. Let's take another example, another native tree, Carpinus caroliniana, the American hornbeam. Of course, all these plants have many common names, and this is why we use one scientific name, why we have to memorize it. American hornbeam is also known as the water beech, the blue beech, ironwood, or musclewood. Those are all common names, and there are many reasons why we should not use common names. First of all, a lot of these well-known plants often have more than one common name, and as we saw there, several common names. These common names are not universal. They're not scientific, really. They're not really describing much about the plant. Two or more plants may have the same common name. In fact, with ironwood, Carpinus caroliniana, there are several different species that are known as ironwood, and they actually look pretty similar. So if you were selling a plant to a customer and they wanted a specific type of ironwood, the native Carpinus caroliniana that grows in our area, then you would need to know that scientific name. You need to be able to exactly define what that plant is. Also, in many cases, a lot of species, particularly rare species of plants, don't even have a common name. They're only described by botanists using their scientific name. So let's look at another example here, this time from Europe. Nymphaea alba, the European white water lily. Of course, this isn't a woody plant, but this really goes to show the whole issue of why we would not use common names. Because in English, there are 15 different names used by different localities to describe the white water lily. In France, we have 44 different names. German, 105 names. And 81 different Dutch names, all for one plant. So, total, 245 different common names for one plant, or one scientific name used internationally, Nymphaea alba. So by using this binomial system of nomenclature, plant names are the same in all languages. It's universal. And every plant has a first and last name, and as I've described before, where the last name is written first. So the genus I often consider to be kind of like the last name, and the species is the specific epithet, or much like a first name. So binomial nomenclature clarifies plant identification. We can look at a plant that we've already talked about in class, the Deodara cedar, Cedrus deodara. looks very similar to the Atlas cedar, Cedrus atlantica. However, the deodorus cedar is not native, used almost entirely in ornament. The Atlas cedar, Cedrus atlantica, guess what? Grows nearby to the Atlantic coast. There are over 1 million botanically different plants in existence, named by the binomial system of nomenclature. That's a lot of plants. There's actually a governing body that controls these plant names and kind of is the judge of what names are approved. And this is the International Congresses in Plant Taxonomy. A bunch of botanists sit around and approve different names and oftentimes actually change these names. So let's go back to plant and also other living organism classification. Of course, we go back to kingdom, division or phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. All plants, of course, are in the plant kingdom, and there are several different phyla that we look at, but in general, we're going to stick to what most gardeners use, and that's the family, genus, and species for our purposes in this class. So what plant part is used for classification? Think about that for a second. Is it the leaves, fruit, the roots and crown of the plant, the bark, flowers, the twigs? Well, they could all be used to classify a plant, but Linnaeus, in his infinite wisdom, based all of his classifications on the sexual parts of the plant, the fruits and the flowers. These tend to be different amongst different species, and really what makes different species capable of breeding with each other. Of course, today we often use DNA and genetics to classify plants, and some of the names and families are changing because of that. However, in many cases, Linnaeus and his peers were correct, and DNA evidence has proven that they were classifying them correctly based on the flowers and fruit. So what does it mean to be a family? A family is a group of plants with similar characteristics, especially the flowers, fruits, and seeds, or the reproductive structures that we use to distinguish each plant. The size of a family varies from 1 to way more than 100. In fact, the largest families have teens of thousands of plants in the family. Some plant families have only one. For instance, at least in existence today, the Ginkgoaceae family has only one genus and species, Ginkgo biloba, that is still in existence today. Now we go back 1 million years and there were many different plants that were in that family, and that's something that paleobotanists study. A wide family, the Rosaceae family, has 100 different genera of plants. Some of these that we will talk about later on include Malus, which is the apple genus, Spirea, and Rosa, the rose genus. Genus, or what I consider the last name of the plant, that we use first, of course, in the species name. Plural, we call genus genera. So you'll often hear me say this genera of plants, or these genera, and in that case I'm just using the plural form of the word. A genus is a group of plants which is closely related, definable group of plants exhibiting similar characteristics such as flowers, fruit, stems, leaves, or roots, and has genetic affinity, or in other words, is capable of breeding with other members of the genus. The genus is almost always a noun. It is always capitalized and can serve to describe quite a few different things. It could be describing a plant's appearance, like the daylily, for instance, hemerocallis. If we were literally to translate that from the Latin, it would mean day and beauty. It's also useful because the daylily only blooms for one day for each flower. So, day beauty. It can also describe supposed medicinal qualities, such as pulmonaria, which the pulmonary valve as part of the lungs. So it is the lungwort genus. This is a perennial herbaceous plant, not one that we will discuss in class, but just knowing the genus could allow you to know that this plant has some medicinal qualities. In some cases, could be a resemblance to body parts. The spring ephemeral wildflower hepatica looks like the hepatic lobe or the liver. Also, genera oftentimes honor a person by using their name. For instance, Kalmia, which is the genus for mountain laurel, honors the botanist Peter Kalm that discovered the plant. All right, let's look at some species names. Species is the specific epithet, the second word in a scientific plant name. Is never capitalized and is usually an adjective that describes the size or color or leaf shape, the growth habit, the origin of the plant, or also to commemorate a person. Many other things that the species or specific epithet could describe. Of course, the specific epithet or the species name can and often does give us hints about the plant. So here are some names. Of course, not all of these are woody plants, but Cattonia Easter horizontalis. Guess what? Cattonia Easter grows horizontally. It's a spreading woody plant. Coreopsis gigantea. What do you think that means? It's a giant flower that the Coreopsis has. Clerodendrum thomsoniae, named after a person, Thomson, a botanist. Godetia grandiflora. Grandiflora means large flower. Cistus X purpureus. We know that X is a hybrid. Purpureus is purple, so this is a purple-colored hybrid of this type of ivy. Chionanthus virginicus. Virginicus could be taken out of context. It can mean quite a few different things in Latin, but for our purposes, it means grows in the eastern part of the United States. The species is the basis of the binomial system of nomenclature. And it is a difficult word to define, and accord of what it actually does. But the best that I can think of is that a species refers to a population of individuals within a genus that are capable of interbreeding freely with one another. And I would add to that that not only do they interbreed freely, but they also retain the same characteristics when they interbreed. So species together can create more plants that look just like them. Of course, they can also hybridize and make plants that look different from them as well. However, that's the important thing to know for a species, is that it is a plant that is capable of interbreeding freely with other plants of the same species, and they retain similar characteristics in the next generation. I'm sure most of you have figured this out by now, but just to review, and after looking at the test, I think a few of you might not have it perfect, but we have to be able to write the plant names correctly. The scientific names should always be underlined or italicized. Underlined on if you're handwriting them, italicized if you're using a computer. The genus is capitalized, the species is not. The name is only complete if it is followed by the name of the person who first described or named it. I'm not going to hold us to that because I don't feel like it's necessary to really memorize the person who identified or described the plant. Usually this is written as a capitalized letter after the plant name, and you'll see that often in our textbook as well as many field guides. However, you don't need to have that information in order to find out more about that. So let's go back to our red oak example. Quercus rubra was named by Linnaeus. So in many texts they write red oak as Quercus rubra with an L after it, honoring Linnaeus, and it is either italicized or underlined especially for handwriting it. Of course, there are more divisions, and we can get more specific with plant names, and we will often do this, as you've already seen. We can look at cultivars, aka cultivated variety. We can look at varieties. This is often considered a natural variety. Hybrids, or forms, different forms of plants. Cultivar or cultivated variety is a horticultural variety. This is a variety of plant that only exists in cultivation. Plants within a species that have been selected especially for particular characteristics and are propagated for that trait. Usually the way that these plants are propagated is asexually. They are clones of one another. Typically the traits that we look at, especially in terms of woody plants, are the growth habits, the flowers, and oftentimes we're looking at fruitless cultivars because people in the landscape industry we're finding prefer to not have to deal with fruit. So we'll look at some, for instance, a sweet gum hybrid cultivated variety that has no fruit. Cultivar names are written in plain text. They're not italicized or underlined. They are capitalized, and if there is more than one word in a cultivar, it is also capitalized. So each word is capitalized. They are set off by single quotes. For example, let's look at the highbush cranberry or Viburnum opulus. And we can see here on the left in the picture below the natural variety Viburnum opulus. This is the species that occurs in nature. It has some showy flowers on the outside of the cluster, and those are sterile flowers. On the inside, it actually has some fertile flowers, and those would actually make fruit and seed. The cultivated variety, Viburnum opulus roseum, is a fruitless variety that has been bred to have showy flowers. So it has a large cluster of only those showy sterile flowers, and hence has no fruit. So write that Viburnum opulus, single quotes, roseum, again capitalized. Or we can also write it in the shorthand notation, Viburnum opulus CV period roseum, without using single quotations. Although I find that most times the single quotes are preferred. All right, let's talk about varieties. Varieties are a little bit different than a cultivated variety. This is a variety that is found in nature, a wild variety. This is a group of plants that is intermediate between species and form, and are usually associated with inheritable differences. And the big thing here is that varieties in nature are recognized as distinct populations that breed true to type. Oftentimes, these natural varieties do give way to cultivated varieties when they are propagated and released in cultivation. However, what we see often with varieties is that they have somehow mutated, changed in nature, and then somehow continued to breed that mutation. Variety names are always written in lowercase, and they are italicized or underlined, depending on if you're typing or writing by hand. For example, the shore pine, Pinus contorta, variety contorta, is one that grows in a specific geographic location that is found outside of the regular Pinus contorta range. The lodgepole pine, Pinus contorta variety latifolia, is the typical range of the plant and has a different type of foliage. Again, variety names, these are usually found in particular geographic areas and only in nature. Hybrids. Again, hybrids I think we've already discussed to some extent, but hybrids are two closely related but distinct species interbred to form a hybrid. They're often sterile and produce no seed or fruit. Hybrid names are written in lowercase and italicized or underlined. An X is placed between the genus and hybrid epithet. So let's look at Platanus occidentalis, which is sycamore, a common native tree, crossed with Platanus orientalis, which is the Asian plane tree. These two, although found geographically different parts of the world, were brought together and bred to form a street tree, a very common plant used in landscaping, known as the London plane tree, Platanus x acerifolia. And if you look closely at the picture there, you can see why it gets that acerifolia. The foliage resembles that of a maple. So it's like a maple leaf sycamore. So here are just some different species with varieties or cultivars. Acer saccharum, the sugar maple, Fraxinus pennsylvanica. Patmore is a cultivated variety of the green ash, the Patmore green ash, very popular in landscaping. Gleditsia tricanthos, variety inermis, is a common honey locust. However, typically honey locusts have thorns. This natural variety was found mutated in nature that has no thorns. And that later on became a cultivated variety and is often planted because of that thornless appearance. So I've talked about our integrated approach to plant identification and how really I prefer to try to use all of our senses. But in general, we're going to use visual inspection of the plant's characteristics. We will use some photographic references, as we already have in class, and oftentimes the internet is a useful tool, especially when it comes to Google. We use plant classification keys, these dichotomous keys, that we'll look at some examples of those in class. And we also use expert advice, as well as just people that work in the industry. So first off, we're going to collect information about what we see. Also, our other senses, what we smell, what we sometimes taste, what we feel, the texture of the leaves. So in these cases, we look at the what we have, what clues we have to give us information about the plant. The appearance of the leaves. And in our class, we're looking at woody plants. So if we're trying to discover a woody plant, are we looking at something that is a conifer with needle-like leaves? Evergreens? Are we looking at broad leaves? Are we looking at trees that drop their leaves? Deciduous trees. Gather this information, and this is the kind of stuff I really like to see in your field journal entries. What is the overall form of the plant? On the left here we have a green arrow, Chamaecyparis, and as you can see it has a very narrow arrow-like form. On the right, here is a mounding form of a Japanese maple. Kind of a dwarf form. So these will help us to identify the plant. Look at other characteristics of individual plant parts, like the bark. Is it in one layer? Is it shedding bark? Look at the fruit. Does it have fruit or not? Look at the leaves. Do they come to a point or not? Are they thick and waxy or not? Look at the flowers. Count the number of petals in some cases, the number of other flower parts. We'll get into that later on in another module. Maybe even look at the number of points on a leaf, or the deepness of the lobes in between these points. And what we'll be talking about soon, looking at the stem and the bud of the plants. This becomes especially important in the winter months when we don't have leaves or flowers to help us identify the plant. So we'll look at the terminal bud. That's going to be the bud on the end of the branch. We'll look at leaf scars, where a leaf once was. And as you can see in the leaf scar there, it also has the bud for next year's leaf. We'll look at also at the lateral buds and how they are arranged. And in this drawing, they're opposite of each other. Sometimes we'll look at these lenticels, which are these little spots on a branch or stem of a woody plant that helps it to breathe. We'll look at the bud scales, or the way that the bud is covered and protected in the winter months. Amongst the leaf scar, we'll also look here at the vascular bundle trace. How many of those vascular bundle traces there are. We'll also look at the terminal bud scale scar. That is where the previous year's growth ended and the next year's growth began. And the pith, which is the area inside of a twig. In some cases, the pith can also help us to identify species amongst a genus. So looking closely at some buds here, on the left we have leaf buds of a beech tree. And on a beech, they are often referred to as cigar-shaped leaf buds. On the right, we have the leaf buds of a buckeye. And there we can see that large terminal bud. It doesn't just carry the leaf, but it also has the flower inside of it, which makes it a larger bud. We're going to look at the bark too. And in this case, we have several different types of birches. And these birches can be easily identifiable by the bark, whether it's smooth and sheen and coppery, like the species on the left, or on the right, where it's starting to exfoliate and shred off in sheets. Finally, we'll talk about using dichotomous keys to identify plants. And a dichotomous key is just basically kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure of plant identification. It offers us, the user, a choice between two characters. And we try to use the information that we have collected in using all of our senses, looking and feeling the plant, to make an informed decision between which character fits it best. And we started to work through the dichotomous keys a little bit through some simple examples, but later on we'll do some more complex examples as well. Here's just an example of a dichotomous key. Take a moment to look over it. This is just a very simple example, and in this case we're looking at conifers, and A is leaves that are needle-like, AA leaves that are flattened and scale-like. So just look over that for a second. This will kind of help you to maybe look at some of the things that we've already looked at again. So that's it for Module 1. Again, I've abbreviated this so that we can have more time to go over the rest and kind of fit all of our modules still within the class. I'm probably going to also abbreviate Modules 2 and 3. I hope this has been valuable. Please give me some feedback on this after you view this presentation.